I can't help but feel attacked.
Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and Jemma from Jemma Books have announced a May read-along called Misery May, in which they intend to subject the world to the writings of Thomas Hardy, the most miserable perhaps of all authors. And to make matters worse, as if that wasn't enough to add insult to injury, Scott then did a video in which he invited booktubers to name their most miserable books and talk about them, and I wasn't invited. It's a personal attack, and this is my response. Of course, all that's just a joke. I really like the idea of having a Misery May in which people read Thomas Hardy. It's possible I might actually join in, and Scott had the reasonable excuse of not inviting me to participate in Misery May, A, because he can do whatever he wants to, it's his channel, and B, because I was traveling at the time, and he didn't think I'd be able to make a video, and he was probably right. This is still my answer, because I feel like I'm missing out on Misery May, and nothing says misery like, you know, bookish in May right before summer begins. So this is a list of 11 miserable novels that I mostly like. Some of these are books that I really like, some of these are books that I don't really like. I will not be mentioning 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, nor will I be discussing Wuthering Heights, which is miserable. Nor will I be talking about and putting in my list here Blood Meridian. Basically, I've talked about those books. Those books come up often. I also won't be talking about At Night All Blood is Black, which I did a whole video about last week. These 3 books, some of which I rarely talk about, some of which I've mentioned several times, but books that are miserable. And what I mean by miserable is that they deal with miserable subjects and there's almost no hope involved in any of them. So the first one of my books, my list of miserable novels, is The Plague by Albert Camus. Camus wrote this novel kind of set in a fictionalized version of the Algerian town of Oran, set during a plague, literally a disease which is killing people, and it's miserable because government officials and people don't listen, and they don't listen to experts, and there's all this kind of, you know, discussion about what's causing it, and all these kind of efforts to kind of solve the problem, which result in more and more kind of draconian measures, including setting up, you know, isolation wards for the sick and not letting people leave and all these kind of things. It just occurred to me that coming off perhaps the lockdowns of the pandemic we just had, this may not be a book that you enjoy reading, but hey, this is a list of miserable books. The only reason why I hesitate to put it on the list is that the plague does come to an end and there's a little bit of hope at the end. So the second book on my list of miserable novels is Malloy by Samuel Beckett. I put this one on the list for 2 reasons. One, it's the one I understand the least. And I've watched videos and I've read Malloy, and I've tried to understand it. And 2, because it is miserable. The story follows essentially 2 characters who seem to be really similar. One named Malloy, who for whatever reason lives with his invalided sick mother, and writes, but doesn't care what he writes, and people come and pick up the pages, and all he really does is ride around on his bicycle, and in riding around his bicycle he has a confrontation with police and another person, and there's violence. And then the second character is, I believe, named Malone? Anyway, I may have forgotten the second character's name, who is in fact a policeman who goes out searching for Malloy to arrest him, and he takes his son with him, and then they have misadventures, and there's violence, and it's all just kind of really depressing, as I think Samuel Beckett has a tendency to be. So that's the second novel on my list. The third novel on my list of miserable novels may be the one that I like the most. I'm looking at the stack right here. It may be my favorite of the miserable novels on my list, and that's Cousin Bette by Honoré de Balzac. You knew I couldn't make a video in which I listed books without having a Balzac novel. Cousin Bette is, in fact, a masterpiece, one of Balzac's kind of later works, and in it we see Cousin Bette, who lives with her kind of distant family, who resents them because of their money, because of the respect they have, because of their physical beauty. Cousin Bette falls in love with a young artist, and then that young artist ends up getting engaged to Cousin Bette's niece or cousin. Cousin Bette swears revenge on the family. She takes advantage of the the patriarch of the family's affinity for young women and his lustfulness to try to entrap him in a scandal, and she does exactly that. And the ramifications are incredible and incredibly bad for this family in terms of broken engagements, suicides, death, disgrace, dishonor, remarriage. Cousin Bette, you might think, haha, emerges triumphant from the story, but she doesn't. She and one of the young women she used as kind of her tool to ruin the family die horrible, gruesome deaths. Just a great novel. At number 4 on my list of books that are miserable is Tender as the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This tells the story of Nick and Nicole Diver, who are this kind of fabulous family, fabulous couple who lived on the French Riviera, and they attracted all these kind of writers and artists to them, and then the problems that marriage had. Turns out Nicole Diver suffered from a mental illness. Dick Diver is a psychologist. He kind of fell in love with her because she was his patient, and he felt like he was helping her. But she continues to have problems. Dick falls in love with a young actress and wants to have an affair with her, and violence ensues, and then the marriage breaks down, and then Dick Diver becomes an alcoholic. His wife becomes institutionalized, and it's just really grim and sad in all kinds of ways. But it's made more so sad in all kinds of ways because if you know anything about the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, you can see, I think, some fairly obvious parallels between Fitzgerald's own life and the life of the divers that he's writing about. At number 5 on my list, I have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is not my favorite novel, and I'll admit that there are things about this novel that I really don't like, but I know a lot of people like it, and I certainly can't fault Ishiguro's writing. He's a brilliant writer. It's more the story and the plot they have an issue with. But this is a miserable book. It starts off at what appears to be kind of an English boarding school, which has both boys and girls, and so it contains that kind of English boarding school kind of stuff with an added element of tension and mystery going on. And so we have a lot of the angst of teenagers, and then they grow up and they find out kind of what their actual purpose in life is, which is kind of shattering to them, and they try to find a way out only to have hope destroyed, and that's all pretty miserable. I don't know, there's much more miserable. There are very few things that are more miserable than destroying the hopes of young people, which maybe makes it a really good commentary on modern society today. At number 6 on my list, I have A Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and I would kind of argue that John Steinbeck is possibly one of the most miserable of all American authors. If you think about his books, The Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, the Red Pony novella story, there's a lot of misery here. And in Of Mice and Men, we see Lenny and George, who are kind of down on luck fellows who are traveling across the United States of America. Lenny is somebody who definitely has a mental handicap, a learning disability, and he behaves in ways which cause problems, which lead to violence. This is a book with an intense friendship which has to end tragically because of things that one of the characters does. It's incredibly short. If you've never read it, you should probably pick it up and read it. I do think that Steinbeck, for me, is oftentimes heavy-handed in his symbolism and obviousness, and this book suffers from those things, but I do think it's probably Steinbeck's best short non-comedic novel, which is damning with faint praise. At what am I up to? Number 7 on my list, I have The Man with the Golden Arm by Nelson Algren. I've talked about this book several times on my channel because it is one of those books which I really liked, but it is a miserable book. It tells the story of Frankie Machine, who is a World War II veteran who was wounded during the war and became addicted to opium. He wants to be a drummer, a jazz drummer, but he also is a talented dealer of cards, and so he works in a backroom poker place dealing cards. That's how he makes his money, which means he gets involved with organized crime and criminals. His wife is in a wheelchair. We don't know if it's because she physically can't get up or because something's happened to her that caused her to have a mental breakdown, which made her believe that she can't get up. She spends most of her time looking out the window and then yelling at Frankie. He falls in love with, or he meets up with an old flame. They have an affair. The poop hits the fan. He has to go on the run, and things end tragically on April Fool's Day. And I'll leave it at that so that I don't spoil too much of the book. But it is, I think, a great novel, but it is definitely a miserable one. Next on my list is New Grub Street by George Gissing. I just read this book this year, is that right? Or last year for Victober. And it is miserable. It follows the lives of two writers, one of whom is talented and serious and earnest and wants to write, you know, really serious fiction, and another who just wants to be able to earn his living through writing, and he's very driven, he can be very unscrupulous. It tells the story of the serious writer's continued failure and how that contributes to the disintegration of his marriage, the ambitious writer's willingness to use people to get ahead, which leads to tragedy. And it is one of those books where the people who you think are the good guys in the book lose, and the people you think are the unscrupulous and unethical people end up winning, and that is very unsettling. You know, you probably don't realize how rarely in books that happens, but that does happen in New Grub Street, and I think it's great. The next book on my list, this would be the 9th book on my list, is The Family of Pascual Duarte by Camilo Jose Cela. This is called, in Portuguese, this is a book which is considered one of the foundational works of what they call tremendizo, I believe, books, which are books about tremendously awful things happening. I've talked about this book on my channel before, and it is indeed a miserable book. And it basically is Pascual Duarte is in prison recounting his life, why he came to murder his mother, the impact that's had on his family. And let me just say, there's more than one murder. There is tremendous marital infidelity. There's prostitution. There's pimps. There's prison. It's grim. That's what I would say. The next book on my list is from another Nobel Prize winner, by the way. Cela won the Nobel Prize in sometime in the 40s, and that is J.M. Coetzee, whose novel Disgrace is one of the most miserable books I think I've ever read. It's miserable in all kinds of ways. The events described in it are miserable. The main character, who more or less tells the story, is a miserable person who you don't like. Terrible, awful things happen. Rape, dispossession, sexual assault, the end of a career, and then, you know, killing of animals. That all happens in Disgrace. And one of the things which I found most miserable about the book, and I have to tell you, I like the book a lot. I think it's a great book. One of the things I think is most miserable about the book is that you as the reader are, I think, left unsettled about how to feel about what's happened and the characters and what's right and what's wrong. And for that reason, I think the book is absolutely brilliant. And then I couldn't have a list of miserable books if I didn't include the American King of Misery. That is Cormac McCarthy. My goodness, can the man write a book which isn't miserable? And I would say very rarely. The temptation here would be to include Blood Meridian, which is miserable. I know a lot of people would include The Road, which is also just misery after misery. But the problem with The Road is, for me, an inclusion on this list is it ends with a glimmer of hope, and therefore it's off this list. And the book I chose to put on this list is actually a Cormac McCarthy novel I don't like very much. One reason why I didn't put Blood Meridian on the list is I think it is a brilliant book, and I think it is McCarthy's masterpiece and one of the truly great American novels. I put Outer Dark on the list because it's equally miserable, I think, to The Road and to Blood Meridian, but it's not nearly as good. So Outer Dark tells the story of a brother and sister, and if you know anything about McCarthy, you should know there's a plot point in there already. About a brother and sister, Culla, and her name is Renthi, I believe, is his sister, who essentially, let's just say there's a child involved, there's child abandonment, those two go their separate ways, both on a journey looking for this child. Cullen has all kinds of adventures which turn out incredibly badly for him. He meets all kinds of people, mostly bad. His steps are hounded by this group of 3 men who are truly awful and commit lots of murders, and who he has some interactions with, who end up being the people who, you know, he was probably looking for. Renthie goes off on her own journey, trying to be careful to stay away from Cullen, finds her way into good and bad situations, and ultimately tracks down the person who took her child, and there's an unsatisfactory ending. It is unrelentingly grim. That's how I would put it. It is unrelentingly grim, and it is not nearly as good a story as the equally unrelentingly grim Blood Meridian. And it doesn't have as many memorable characters as Blood Meridian, so I chose Outer Dark for this list of miserable books. Anyway, there you go. There are my list of 11 miserable books. Gee, thanks for asking, Scott. Anyway, this is my response to that. And for those of you who are participating in Misery May or May Misery, the Thomas Hardy read-along, readathon, enjoy the misery. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.